Hey everybody, I'm Danny Grossman, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your question answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on the criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz, and thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
Well, we have a special treat for you today. We are delighted to have in our studio Owen Alterman, one of the many students who studied under your tutelage at Harvard Law School. And as your student, he was one of the research assistants who helped you compile your landmark book, The Case for Israel. Today, he lives in Israel, where Owen is making a name for himself at I-24 News, after serving at one of Israel's top think tanks, Amos Yadlin's Institute for National Security Studies. Well, welcome, Owen.
Good to be here, Danny.
So our first question today comes from Tal Or-Cohen, a lawyer who moved to Israel from Washington, D.C. She was an Argo Fellow at the Herzliya Interdisciplinary Center, and she's been following closely the Senate confirmation hearings and is actually quite interested in the process, which she believes is at least as important, if not more important, than the actual outcome itself. And not just in this case, but with repercussions for the entire justice system. So let's hear from her.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. This is Tal Or-Cohen. I made Aliyah from Maryland in 2009. Today, I'm a lawyer in Tel Aviv. I wanted to hear your perspective on the recent Kavanaugh hearings and the increasing role of the court of public opinion. On the one hand, we have these hearings. On the other hand, we have proven biases in the justice system against people of color. Is it true that the presumption of innocence is an endangered species today? And relating to that, the court of public opinion seems to be an increasingly inhospitable place for Israel, specifically becoming a polarizing topic between Democrats and Republicans, and more importantly, their voters. On a recent trip to the United States, a friend of mine said, "It's hard today to be a Democrat and to support Israel." I wanted to hear your take on this, and also, has it been more difficult to make the case for Israel, considering the recent approval of the nation-state law?
Well, I like very much the way you relate the two issues. They're obviously not directly related, but burden of proof, presumptions of innocence when it comes to accusations of sexual misconduct, and burdens of proof and presumptions of innocence when it comes to allegations against Israel, many of which are believed in the face of contrary evidence. You know, we live at a time when truth is very much being challenged. The extreme left in America doesn't believe in truth. Everybody has their own truth. Who do you believe, me or your lying eyes, as Groucho Marx once put it? And I think that's become an issue on college campuses, particularly around the country. No matter how much evidence you present on an issue, they say, look, truth is an individualized factor. It grows out of identity politics. It grows out of who you are, not what the facts are. And I think we're seeing that play out both in the court of public opinion when it comes to Israel and in the confirmation process in general. Look, I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal the other day in which I challenged the notion that the confirmation process for Kavanaugh is simply just a job interview. First of all, if it were a job interview, it would be so unfair because almost half of the people who have to decide whether to give him the job decided against doing it the day he was nominated without hearing one scintilla of evidence. But then once he was accused of the most horrendous crimes imaginable, including active participation in drugging women and lining them up for gang rapes. And he's being compared, to some of the worst offenders in the world, people who are who have already been convicted, Bill Cosby. Then the process shifts from, if it ever was a job interview, to a mini trial. And I think you need process, and I think you need proof by clear and convincing evidence. For me, this is an education moment. Let me give you an example. This woman named Julie Sedgwick, who claimed to have evidence and witnesses, none of the witnesses have appeared, that Kavanaugh and his friend Judge were actively involved in spiking drinks and giving drugs and then raping helpless women. She has to be thoroughly investigated. If she made an honest mistake and it happened and maybe it was somebody else, that's one thing. But if she sat there and did the Hamlet moment, to be or not to be a perjuring felon, to falsely accuse somebody deliberately of a crime you know he didn't commit, this woman has to be prosecuted and has to be imprisoned. We have to send a double message to people in our society. One, you do not engage in sexual assault no matter how old you are. There's no excuse for a 17-year-old to engage in sexual assault. That's message number one. Number two, an equally important message, I emphasize an equally important message, is do not falsely accuse anybody of a crime as heinous as rape. And if you do either of those things, there will be consequences. Right now, there are massive consequences for young men or men of every age who rape or assault. That's a good thing. But there are no consequences for women who, with or without their lawyer's help, make up stories for financial gain, for revenge against innocent people. That has to change. Moving to Israel, I think the same thing is true. If you have credible assertions about misconduct on the part of Israeli soldiers, etc., make them. But if you are proved to have made false charges, as Hamas has over and over and over again, then your credibility must be questioned. Students for Justice for Palestine over and over again have leveled false charges at Israel. These are blood libels. And there has to be a process of proof because truth is important. The marketplace of ideas is important. We just cannot allow truth to become something that is subjective and based on identity politics rather than evidence-based science.
Well, Alan, you've written extensively and appeared on all the U.S. news outlets. Do you see this process taking a dangerous turn? For example, the case of Georgetown professor Christine Fair, who wrote a provocative tweet which resulted in her being kicked off Twitter. And also, as you mentioned, the ACLU's taking out a video in which they show pictures of Judge Kavanaugh with, right before convicted felon Bill Cosby.
Look, that professor at Georgetown deserves to be so attacked. If she had made the opposite argument, if she had used language like that against African Americans or against women or against Muslim Americans, she would be so despised and so attacked. But since the attack is on old white men, then she gets a pass. And you can't give people passes for that kind of comment. Look, she has free speech rights to say what she wants, but we have free speech rights to attack her and condemn her. And I think there has to be a single standard. If she would have been fired for making these kinds of statements against other groups, she should be fired for making statements against white men. I wouldn't support that, but the equity has to be identical. So I think we have to have a single standard. As far as the ACLU is concerned, it should change its name from the American Civil Liberties Union to the Anti-Civil Liberties Union. What happened is, when I was on the national board of the ACLU, it had a small budget. It defended unpopular people neutrally. Once Trump was elected, its budget went, as I understand it, from 20 million to 130 million, and it's chasing the money. It's chasing Hollywood money, and the only way it gets Hollywood money is if it abandons civil liberties and simply devotes itself full-time to getting Trump, getting his nominees, supporting candidates on the left, opposing Supreme Court nominees, all of which are in violation of its traditions and its mandate. So the ACLU was not only stopped being a civil liberties organization, it's turned into an anti-civil liberties organization. It now says that if there's any suspicion, that's enough. Imagine if it said that during the McCarthy period, if it said that a person fired from a job because of suspicion of communism, well, it's only a job interview. And if there's any suspicion that he might at any point have been a communist, that's enough to get rid of him from his job. They never would have said that. And I think that double standard has to be criticized and condemned.
So now let's turn our attention back to the landmark book for The Case for Israel. Owen, you were an integral member of the team that put that book together. Can you share with us your thoughts about that project and how these lessons apply today?
Well, Danny, obviously a very, very important book, as you said. And I think the most important thing to understand about the book is the time in which it was written. I mean, this book was a child of the Second Intifada. I mean, as this book was being put together, the United States was not only in the wake of 9/11, but the Second Intifada was happening here on the streets in Israel. And I remember very, very clearly sitting in my room at the law school and working and studying and working for my classes and then seeing the footage of what was happening here. It was a very, very difficult time. A difficult time, of course, here in Israel, and I think a very difficult time morale-wise for advocates for Israel, people who feel connected to Israel in the United States. Obviously a very, very important book. I think looking back on it 15 years later, what's so interesting to me, and I'm interested in Professor Dershowitz and your reactions to this as well, is that the landscape has changed so much. You know, Danny, in 2002, you know, by the way, people who talk about the BDS movement say it started in 2005. That's fake news. There was a divestment petition at Harvard in 2002. Professor Dershowitz is nodding because he remembers it clearly. And the depth of the Second Intifada. And there was no organization really to respond to it. The counter petition was an ad hoc petition. I think it was just some professor at the university who happened to put it on his website. And then, of course, it got many times as many signatures as the divestment petition itself. And now in 2018, we're living in a world in which not only are there organizations that are fighting what they see as the delegitimization of Israel, but there's been a huge mobilization. A lot of these organizations didn't even exist in 2003, let alone have the kinds of budgets they do. And whereas in 2003, I think the attitude here in Israel on this issue was how many divisions does the Pope have? You know, people didn't really take this seriously. And now, not only do people take it seriously, but we actually have so many ministers in this country who are fighting over this portfolio that's a huge political issue here. And the efforts against it are almost like intelligence operations. So it's just a vastly changed landscape. And I think it was some of those early efforts that put this on the agenda, not only for pro-Israel advocates in the United States, but also on the Israeli public agenda here. And now we're seeing the results. And I'm actually interested in what Professor Dershowitz, what you have to say. Has this mobilization made a difference? Have you seen an impact of all that's happened in the last 15 years? And has it really changed the playing field in the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the United States, especially in college campuses?
Well, it definitely has, without a doubt. And one of the reasons that I decided to use brilliant young students like you and Natalie Portman and others to help me write this book is I saw the BDS movement beginning. And I went to the leadership of the Jewish and pro-Israel community in the United States, and they all had the same message from me: ignore it, it's going away, it has no influence. And I said, no, I see it coming on college campuses. Being somebody who has taught now for over 50 years on university campuses, I see that students, even though what they seem to be doing might be extreme and marginal at the time, are often catching a wave. And that wave then manifests itself 15, 20 years later among young and then older and more serious leaders. Remember that the people who ultimately became some of the great leaders of our country were Harvard and Yale and Princeton and New York City College students in the early 21st century. So I felt it was very important to try to catch that wave. Things have changed dramatically. I have a new book I've just finished writing. It's being edited right now. And it's a 70-year memoir of defending Israel, starting in 1948 with arguments in Camp Masad in Hebrew with a counselor there named Noam Chomsky, who was a member of the extreme left, but still pro-Israel Shomer HaTzair. And I tell in my book, decade by decade, prime minister by prime minister, president by president, the changing relationship between the United States, particularly in Israel, between college students and Israel. You'll remember that one of the reasons I wrote the book is because a kid who had gone to, I think, Camp Ramah, who was very astute about Israeli matters, who had been to Israel many times, came to me during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance, and said that he needed to be forgiven because he never speaks out about Israel. And I asked him why. He said, because if he's perceived as a Zionist, this is in the early 2000s, he wouldn't be popular, he wouldn't get dates, he wouldn't be invited to join fraternities, clubs, and that kind of thing. And that was very significant to me. And I decided that it had to become cool again to defend Israel. And at the very least, students had to have a primer that they could have available to them. That's when we decided on the format for the book, the question and answer format, the critique that is made, who makes it, what is the truth, how to respond. And I think the format really helped the book become a useful tactical device on university campuses. And then it spread beyond the campuses. So I'm really pleased. And my new book, I think, will kind of fill the gap that now exists, because, as you said, it's almost 2 decades since that book.
Well, Alan, as you remember, right after you published the book, you came to Israel at the Herzl Conference, and we got the book translated into Hebrew, because we said Israelis don't know how to make the case for Israel. And of course, it's been translated to many other languages. So how important, Alan, is it to get every one of the facts right? If I'm not mistaken, you were once quoted as saying you would give $10,000 to anyone who would find a single error in the book. By the way, a lot of people have turned to me saying, I found a mistake, where's my money? So, but my question is, do facts really matter that much anymore, since people seem to have their minds made up even before they hear, read, or see a single piece of evidence regarding Israel's situation?
Well, first of all, you were responsible, of course, for having the book translated, for having the book distributed on El Al. I said a willful fact, a willful mistake. Oh, yes, there was a typo here and a typo there, but the facts were all accurate because we followed it so carefully. We documented every single fact. Facts may not be important, but mistakes are important. If you write a controversial book like this, and if you have mistakes and they're seen as deliberate and willful mistakes, even one mistake or two mistakes can destroy the credibility of a book. Look at the Peters book from time immemorial. I think that book had a lot of very important information, a lot of very important facts, but it was a little careless at some point in how it gathered some of the demographic information. And of course, for that reason, Chomsky and Finkelstein and others jumped all over it and tried to discredit the book. Of course, Chomsky and Finkelstein tried to discredit my book. Finkelstein said, I didn't write the book. I didn't write a word of it. It was written by the Mossad. Oh, and I didn't realize you had been a member of the book. But you helped me write the book. So, but people made up all kinds of far-fetched stories about the origins of the book and how I didn't write a word of it, how I plagiarized it from Peters because I had a quote from Mark Twain, and I committed the sin of actually quoting Mark Twain's book, Innocents Abroad, instead of attributing the quote to Peters, who had used the same quote in the book, even though I had used the quote 10 years before Peters wrote her book in my first debate with Noam Chomsky in 1970, even more than 10 years earlier. So, you know, you have to anticipate, if you're going to write a book that's perceived as supportive of Israel, it's going to be attacked. It's going to be attacked falsely. It's going to be attacked unfairly. And if you Google me today, Dershowitz plagiarist, you'll see those allegations are still out there, even though I wrote every single word of that book by hand with the help of my research students.
Well, Owen, do you have anything more to say about that?
Well, look, I mean, I think Professor Dershowitz really captured it. You know, obviously accuracy is very, very important and facts are important. But I think around advocacy in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Danny, I think both parties have learned that the facts are important, but the pictures are also very, very important. And the emotions are very, very important. You know, this is a conflict that gets so much traction internationally. Again, this is wearing my senior international affairs correspondent hat from I-24 News. You know, this conflict gets so much traction emotionally, so much traction internationally because of the emotional attachment to it. And that's why it's grafted onto so many other conflicts, whether it be the culture wars in the United States, the conflict in Northern Ireland, the situation in South Africa, according to certain people, you know, just so many other parts of the world that the emotions are very important, the pictures are very important, and I think that that's a message that both sides to this have learned, not only over the course of the past 15 years, but really even long before that.
I think Hamas has learned that lesson better than Israel. And I think Hamas has developed this technique, which I have called cruelly, to be sure, the dead baby strategy, where Hamas understands that as soon as it can produce a picture of one dying child, no matter whether the rocket was fired by Hamas itself or by Israel, whether the picture is an authentic one or an inauthentic one, that gets the attention of the world. And then it takes weeks and weeks and weeks for Danny, as he did so effectively some years ago, to gather information about what was going on in Lebanon, present it to the New York Times, and finally have the New York Times write a story about how Hezbollah was using weapons that was stored in civilian homes. But it took Danny and others so much time to rebut simple pictures that it's so important for Israel to understand that how the conflict is presented in the court of public opinion initially is crucially important. And, you know, the Israelis, when they plan any kind of a military activity, must be planning how to respond, even how to preempt in the court of public opinion before a single shot is fired.
Danny, maybe one more quick comment along those lines. I think Israel really faces a tough conundrum here. On the one hand, it's so important to Israel and to its political establishment, its military establishment, to project strength. It's part of Israel's deterrent strategy, and it's important for public opinion here. On the other hand, when fighting the public relations war abroad, the Hasbara war, and to use the Israeli term, it's important sometimes to project weakness, because that's something that people can connect with emotionally. And I think Israel is often caught between the two, particularly in the thick and in the midst of military conflicts, the likes of which we've seen over the last 15 years in Lebanon and in Gaza, that I think the Israeli establishment often, and even the Israeli military, often finds it hard to thread the needle between the two, putting the country in a very, very tough position.
I agree. I think two of the great resources we have doing that are Owen and Danny. The two of you together and independently have seen this problem before I think many others saw it. And I think the work you've done, both of you have done, in trying to present facts preemptively early on with sensitivity has done an enormous amount to help produce a truer picture of what's going on in Israel. Look, there'll always be propaganda wars, and the other side will always take the worst case scenario. I think what Israel needs and what the three of us, I think, together represent is not Hasbara in the sense of propaganda, but Hasbara in the sense of factual truth, nuance, calibration. I think we win when we don't engage in the kind of overstatement that the other side does, but when we respond to overstatement by careful, nuanced presentation of facts, even when the facts sometimes hurt.
Super. No, I just wanted to make one quick comment. I mean, obviously, we talked about facts are important. I will say this. Obviously, I worked on the case for Israel when I was a law student. Here in Israel, my role is a little bit different. And when I go on TV, my role isn't to make the case for Israel. My role is to help people understand better what's happening as an analyst, as a commentator. Obviously, Israel advocates, pro-Israel advocates, Danny, obviously feel that the more the facts are out there, that it helps Israel's case. Obviously, pro-Palestinian advocates feel the same way. But again, I see my role as helping to bring out the facts and help people understand better the situation of what's happening here on the ground in the Middle East.
And you do a great job. You are an analyst, and I listen with great care and always learn from everything you say.
Thanks so much.
Well, I think you'd both agree that those facts that leads you into the words that you've been seeing opposite your eyes for your whole 50 years at Harvard, and of course when you were there, which is veritas, just getting the truth out there. And I think, hopefully with people like yourselves fighting that, maybe we'll keep that fight up. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you, Professor Dershowitz, for your time. And I'd also like to thank our guest, Owen Alterman. Now, if you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV or our Facebook page and submit them. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much.